Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff. We're talking about former President Trump's second term.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically a speech he gave to the World Economic Forum in Davos, just a few days after his inauguration.
It's definitely a fascinating time to be analyzing U.S. politics. This speech, it's packed with claims about the economy and his policy agenda.
Right.
But what's really interesting to me is how it's landing compared to what he was saying on the campaign trail.
You've hit on exactly what caught my attention too.
Right.
We've got the speech itself.
Okay.
News articles covering the reactions, and even your own notes where you flag some specific points.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, we could start with the economy.
Right.
One of Trump's biggest campaign promises was to tackle inflation and get the economy back on track.
Right.
He blamed the Biden administration for what he called economic chaos, pointing to rising prices and a growing national debt.
Right. And in his Davos speech, he doubles down on this bleak picture.
It does.
Claiming the U.S. accumulated $8 trillion in debt under Biden and blaming the previous administration for a whopping $230 billion trade deficit. He really paints a dire picture, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about the high cost of living,
Right.
the challenges businesses are facing,
Yeah.
and even accuses Biden of completely losing control of the country. But then when he outlines his solutions, things start to get a little murky.
That's what I found so intriguing. During the campaign, he was all about massive tax cuts, especially for businesses. He promised it would create jobs and boost the economy.
Yeah.
But now he's expressing concern about the national debt and the need for fiscal responsibility.
Right.
How does that square with his plans for these huge tax cuts?
That's one of the big inconsistencies that jumps out. He's also talking about freezing hiring in federal agencies and creating a new department focused on improving efficiency. Those sound like measures aimed at cutting spending, which seems at odds with the kind of expansive economic policy he was advocating for during the campaign.
It's like he's trying to appeal to two different audiences at the same time.
Right.
Those who are worried about government spending and those who want to see tax cuts and economic growth.
Exactly. And it's not just the economy where we see this shift in tone.
Yeah.
Remember how on the campaign trail, he was a vocal critic of the Green New Deal and promised to unleash American energy production?
Oh, yeah. He was all about energy dominance and bringing back coal jobs. But what's he saying now?
Well, in his Davos speech, he declares a state of emergency in the energy sector to fast-track new infrastructure projects.
Okay.
He talks about the vast oil and gas reserves in the U.S. and his commitment to utilizing them. But he also mentions investing in new technologies and creating a more diversified energy portfolio. It's a slightly softer stance than what we heard during the campaign.
So it seems like he's acknowledging the need for a more nuanced approach to energy, perhaps recognizing that a complete return to fossil fuels might not be feasible or even desirable in the long run.
That's one interpretation. It could also be a strategic move to appease different stakeholders,
Right.
including those who are concerned about climate change and the need for cleaner energy sources.
It'll be interesting to see how these policies actually play out in the coming months and years.
Definitely.
Speaking of inconsistencies, let's talk about his approach to international relations.
Okay.
On the campaign trail, he often took a very hard line, especially when it came to China. He called them cheaters and threatened them with tariffs.
Right.
What's his tone like now?
It's definitely more measured.
Okay.
He still talks about the need for fair trade practices, but he also acknowledges the importance of the U.S.-China relationship, calling it the most important relationship in the world. He even claims to have a good personal relationship with President Xi. It's a far cry from the fiery rhetoric we heard during the campaign.
That's a significant shift. And it makes you wonder what's driving it. Is it a genuine change of heart? Or is he just trying to avoid rocking the boat too much early in his second term?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's worth noting that the global landscape has changed quite a bit since his first term.
Right.
The war in Ukraine has created new challenges and alliances, and the U.S. economy is in a much more fragile state.
Yeah.
Perhaps he's recognizing the need for a more pragmatic approach to foreign policy in light of these developments.
Okay, so we're seeing some potential softening of his stance on China. What about his other big campaign promise to bring peace to Ukraine?
Right.
Remember how he was going to sit down with Putin and broker a deal?
Yeah.
What's he saying about that now?
Well, he reiterates his desire to meet with Putin and negotiate peace.
Okay.
He describes the war as a bloodbath and a real carnage,
Yeah.
emphasizing the devastating loss of life and the destruction of cities. He even goes so far as to say that if he had remained president, the war would never have happened.
That's a bold claim, but it does suggest that he's still committed to playing a role in resolving the conflict, even though he's now approaching it from a position of power rather than as a candidate making campaign promises.
It's important to remember that his campaign rhetoric often relied on simplistic solutions to complex problems.
Right.
Now that he's back in the Oval Office, he's faced with the realities of governing and the need to navigate a much more nuanced global landscape.
It's like the difference between talking the talk and walking the walk.
Yeah.
Campaigning is all about making promises and appealing to voters' emotions.
Right.
Governing is about making tough choices, balancing competing interests,
Exactly.
and dealing with the messy realities of international diplomacy.
Precisely. And that's where the inconsistencies we're seeing become really interesting. They offer a glimpse into the challenges he's facing as he tries to reconcile his campaign rhetoric with the complexities of actually governing.
So what you're saying is that we shouldn't necessarily take these shifts in tone as a sign of weakness or flip-flopping.
Right.
It could be that he's simply adapting to the realities of the situation and trying to find a more pragmatic way forward.
Exactly. It's too early to say for sure what these changes mean in the long run, but they're definitely something we need to keep an eye on as we analyze his second term.
Okay, so we've talked about the economy, energy, and foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, those controversial statements he made during the campaign
Right.
that continued to cause a stir. For example, his claims about winning the election by a landslide, despite all evidence to the contrary. Does he address that at all in his Davos speech?
He does.
Okay.
Right from the start, he claims to have won the recent election by 1 million votes and even doubles down later in the speech, saying he won 7 swing states.
Wow, so he's not backing down from that claim at all. That seems like a pretty risky move, especially given how divisive the last election was.
It is. It suggests he's either completely convinced of his own victory or he's deliberately trying to undermine public trust in the electoral process.
Right.
Either way, it's a worrying sign for the future of American democracy.
Okay, so he's still clinging to that elation claim. What about his other controversial statements? For example, his pledges to end government censorship.
Yeah. Reverse policies on diversity and inclusion. And his very pointed statement affirming his belief in only 2 genders. Does he touch on any of that in Davos?
He certainly does.
Okay.
He accuses the previous administration of suppressing free speech and vows to end what he calls government censorship.
Yeah.
He specifically cites the use of the term disinformation as an example of censorship, claiming that his administration saved free speech in America.
That's interesting because it suggests he's equating any attempt to combat misinformation or hate speech with censorship. And that's a dangerous path to go down.
Absolutely.
Because it opens the door to all sorts of harmful and divisive content.
Absolutely. And it's consistent with his broader agenda of rolling back progress on social justice and equality.
Right.
He also makes it clear in his Davos speech that he intends to reverse policies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, calling them discriminatory policies.
So he's basically signaling to his base that he's going to continue to fight against what they perceive as woke culture and political correctness. Precisely. And that's likely to further polarize the country and make it even more difficult to find common ground on these already contentious issues.
All right, so we've got a lot on the table here. Inconsistencies in his economic policies, a more measured approach to foreign policy,
Yeah.
and a doubling down on some of his most controversial stances. What's the overall takeaway from all of this? What are we seeing here?
I think what we're seeing is a president who is trying to balance the expectations of his base with the realities of governing.
Okay.
He made a lot of big promises during the campaign, but now he's faced with the complexities of actually implementing those promises.
Right.
And that's leading to some contradictions and inconsistencies in his messaging.
So it's not necessarily that he's deliberately misleading people or going back on his word.
Right.
It's more that he's trying to find a way to navigate a very challenging political landscape.
That's how I see it. He's trying to figure out how to be both the firebrand populist who appeals to his base and the pragmatic leader who can actually get things done. And it's not an easy balance to strike.
It definitely makes for a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the coming months and years.
Definitely.
Thanks for helping us unpack all of this. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into Trump's second term.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure dissecting this speech with you.
And for our listeners, we'll be back with part 2, where we'll dig even deeper into the potential consequences of Trump's policies and explore what his second term might mean for the future of the U.S. and the world. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. Welcome back to the deep dive.
We've been analyzing Trump's recent speech at Davos,
Yeah.
particularly the inconsistencies between his campaign promises and his actions since taking office for a second term.
It's like we're seeing two different Trumps.
Yeah.
The one who rallied his base with bold promises, and the one who's now grappling with the complexities of governing.
Exactly. Take his economic policies, for example.
Okay.
He campaigned on massive tax cuts, particularly for businesses, claiming it would stimulate the economy. Yet his Davos speech focused on fiscal responsibility and reducing the national debt.
That's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's also proposed freezing federal hiring and establishing a new department to improve efficiency.
Right.
These measures seem contradictory to his campaign promises of economic expansion.
It seems he's trying to appease different groups simultaneously.
Yeah.
Those concerned about government spending and those expecting tax cuts and economic growth. It's a tough balancing act.
And it's not just about the economy, is it?
No.
His stance on energy has also shifted. Remember how he championed energy dominance and promised to revive the coal industry during his campaign?
Absolutely. He was a vocal critic of the Green New Deal.
Right.
But now, in his Davos speech, he's declared a state of emergency in the energy sector to expedite new infrastructure projects,
Yeah.
mentioning both traditional and renewable energy sources.
So he's acknowledging the need for a more diverse energy portfolio, perhaps recognizing that a complete reliance on fossil fuels isn't feasible or desirable anymore.
It could be a genuine shift in perspective or a strategic move to appease a broader audience,
Okay.
including those concerned about climate change. It's too early to say for sure.
This shift in tone extends to his foreign policy approach as well.
Yeah.
Remember his tough stance on China during the campaign?
Oh, yeah.
He labeled them cheaters and threatened tariffs. But in Davos, he struck a more conciliatory tone.
He stressed the importance of the U.S.-China relationship,
Right.
calling it the most important relationship in the world. He even claimed to have a good personal relationship with President Xi, a far cry from his campaign rhetoric.
It makes you wonder what's behind this change.
I know.
Is it a genuine change of heart or a strategic adjustment to the current global landscape?
Right.
The war in Ukraine and the fragile U.S. economy might be influencing his approach.
It's certainly possible. He might be recognizing the need for a more pragmatic and less confrontational approach to foreign policy. After all, governing is about dealing with realities, not just making promises.
Exactly. And this brings us back to those controversial statements that defined his campaign. Remember his persistent claims of winning the election by a landslide?
Of course.
He reiterated this claim in Davos, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
It's a bold,
Yeah.
and some might say reckless, move. It casts doubt on his commitment to democratic norms and could further erode public trust in the electoral process.
It's certainly concerning.
Yeah.
He's either convinced of his own victory, which raises questions about his grasp of reality, or he's intentionally undermining the legitimacy of the election, which is incredibly dangerous for a democracy.
He also doubled down on his pledges to combat government censorship and reverse diversity and inclusion policies, even calling them discriminatory.
It seems he's catering to his base and their concerns about woke culture.
You're absolutely right. He's signaling his intention to continue his fight against what he perceives as excessive political correctness, which could further divide the country and hinder progress on social justice issues.
So we're seeing this interesting dynamic where Trump is trying to reconcile his campaign promises with the realities of governing. It's leading to inconsistencies and a shift in tone on various issues.
It's like he's trying to be both the firebrand populist his base adores and the pragmatic leader the country needs.
Right.
But it's a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And it's unclear how long he can maintain this balancing act.
His Davos speech provides a fascinating glimpse into this struggle. It reveals the challenges he faces in translating his campaign rhetoric into concrete policies while navigating a complex and ever-changing world.
It's a pivotal moment in his presidency.
Yeah.
The choices he makes now will have significant consequences for the U.S. and the world. We need to be close attention to how these inconsistencies play out and what they mean for the future.
Okay, let's take a step back and try to make sense of all this for our listeners.
Right.
What's the key takeaway here? Why should people care about these inconsistencies and shifts in Trump's messaging?
Well, I think it's crucial for everyone to understand that words have power.
Yes.
Especially when spoken by a leader as influential as the President of the United States.
Yeah.
The things he says, the promises he makes, and the policies he pursues have a real impact on people's lives.
So it's not just about following the political drama. It's about understanding how these decisions might affect our economy, our environment, our relationships with other countries, and even our own personal freedoms.
Exactly. We can't afford to be passive observers.
Right.
We need to be informed, engaged citizens who hold our leaders accountable for their words and actions. That's what a healthy democracy demands.
Now, you mentioned that Trump seems to be trying to appeal to two different audiences, his loyal base and the broader public. But can he really succeed in satisfying both groups with such conflicting messages?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And it remains to be seen whether he can pull it off. It's possible that by trying to please everyone, he ends up pleasing no one.
And what are the potential consequences if he fails to strike that balance?
Well, it could lead to further polarization within the country,
Yeah.
making it even harder to find common ground on critical issues. It could also damage his credibility on the world stage,
Right.
making it difficult to forge alliances and achieve his foreign policy goals.
It's a high-stakes game he's playing,
Yeah.
and the stakes are only getting higher as his second term unfolds.
It's a fascinating and somewhat unsettling time to be analyzing U.S. politics.
Definitely.
The contradictions we're seeing in Trump's messaging reflect the deep divisions within American society and the challenges of governing in an increasingly complex world.
It's a reminder that we can't just take things at face value. We need to dig deeper, question assumptions, and think critically about the information we're consuming.
We need to be discerning consumers of news and information. And we need to engage in thoughtful dialogue with those who hold different viewpoints. That's how we can move beyond the polarization and find solutions to the challenges we face as a nation.
This has been a truly insightful analysis of Trump's Davos speech.
Yes.
And the inconsistencies we're seeing in his second term. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been a pleasure. It's always a privilege to unpack these complex issues with you and our listeners.
And for our listeners, we'll be back with the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore the potential long-term consequences of Trump's policies and consider what his second term might mean for the future of the U.S. and the world. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent this episode unpacking former President Trump's Davos speech.
Yeah.
Focusing on the discrepancies between his campaign promises and his actions since beginning his second term.
It's been a revealing look at the challenges of transitioning from campaigning to governing.
Right.
The reality of the Oval Office often clashes with the rhetoric of the campaign trail.
Absolutely. We've seen this play out in his economic policies, his stance on energy,
Right.
and even his approach to foreign relations.
Yeah.
But what struck me most were his comments on social issues,
Yeah.
particularly those related to diversity and inclusion.
That's a critical area to examine. His Davos speech doubled down on pledges to reverse what he calls discriminatory policies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, signaling a continuation of his culture war tactics.
It seems he's trying to appease his base, those who feel threatened by what they perceive as woke culture and political correctness. But by playing to those fears, isn't he further dividing the country?
That's the danger. These divisive tactics might energize his base, but they also alienate and marginalize those who don't fit into his narrow worldview. It creates a climate of fear and distrust, making it even harder to find common ground on critical issues.
And what about the global implications of these actions? During his first term, we saw a rise in nationalist sentiment and a decline in U.S. global leadership. Could these trends continue or even intensify during his second term?
It's certainly a concern. His America First rhetoric and actions, such as withdrawing from international agreements and imposing tariffs, have strained relationships with allies and emboldened adversaries. If he continues down this path, it could further erode U.S. influence and create a more unstable world order.
So what can we as informed citizens do about this? We've talked about holding leaders accountable.
Right.
But how do we do that effectively in such a polarized political climate?
It's a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. We need to stay informed,
Okay.
engage in respectful dialogue with those who hold different viewpoints,
Right.
and support organizations working to protect democratic values and promote social justice.
And we need to be wary of misinformation and propaganda, especially online. It's easy to get caught up in echo chambers, where we only hear voices that reinforce our existing beliefs. We need to actively seek out diverse perspectives and challenge our own assumptions.
Critical thinking is essential. We can't just passively consume information.
Right.
We need to analyze it,
Yeah.
question its sources, and consider its potential biases. That's how we develop informed opinions and make sound judgments.
And ultimately, it's about participating in the democratic process.
Yeah.
That means voting in elections,
Absolutely.
contacting our elected officials, and advocating for the policies we believe in.
Exactly. Democracy is not a spectator sport.
Right.
It requires active participation from all of us.
Yeah.
We need to raise our voices,
Great.
make our concerns known, and hold our leaders accountable for their actions. That's how we ensure that our government reflects the will of the people.
Well, this has been a really insightful look at Trump's second term. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
It's been a pleasure. Always fascinating to unpack these complex issues, and I hope our listeners found it insightful as well.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep thinking critically about these issues and how they might impact your lives. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.